Pick a single morning roughly 10,000 years ago. The sun comes up on the same planet you're standing on right now. Same continents, same oceans, same species walking around on it. And on that one morning in a valley in what's now Turkey, a group of people are dragging a limestone pillar taller than a house across a hilltop. On a beach in Japan, someone lifts a clay pot off a fire, pottery that's already been made there for thousands of years. And on a desert coast in Chile, someone is rebuilding a human body out of reeds and clay. Same species, same sunrise. Live so different they'd barely have recognized each other as the same kind of creature. We tend to picture ancient humans as one thing. A cave, a fire, a spear, repeat for 200,000 years. But that's not what the evidence shows at all. Humans had already been spread across the planet for tens of thousands of years, and every group had built something entirely their own out of whatever their corner of the world happened to hand them. So let's go and look. 3 places. 3 completely different ways of being human. Start on the coast of Chile. Say mummy, and you think Egypt. Pharaohs, gold masks, pyramids. But the oldest deliberately mummified people on Earth aren't Egyptian, and they weren't royalty. They were made in the Atacama Desert of northern Chile around 7,000 years ago, 2,000 years before the earliest Egyptian mummies. And the people who made them weren't an empire, they were fishermen. They're called the Chinchorro, and they lived in one of the strangest places any humans have ever settled. A thin strip of land between the driest desert on Earth and one of its richest oceans. Behind them, rock and salt flats where it can go a century without rain. In front of them, cold Pacific water so thick with fish that around 90% of everything they ate came out of it. That single fact shaped everything. A reliable food supply meant they didn't have to wander, so they built small permanent camps along the shore and stayed, thousands of years before most of the world worked out how to stay anywhere. They dressed for the coast rather than the cold, simple skirts and loincloths of plant fiber, reed sandals, sometimes a turban-like head wrap. They wove baskets and mats from desert reeds, fished with hooks cut from shell and barbed harpoon points of bone, and took sea lions with harpoons from the shore. And they had time. When the sea feeds you, you get hours that farming societies never had, and the Chinchorro spent theirs on the dead. Bodies were emptied of their organs and taken apart, then rebuilt with reeds, sticks, clay, and sealskin, and coated in a rich black manganese ash paste. Later generations used intense red ochre instead. Faces were given clay masks. Some were fitted with wigs of real human hair. They weren't preserving a corpse. They were making something between a body and a sculpture. And unlike Egypt, where mummification was for the elite, among the Chinchorro it was for everyone, every member of society, not just the privileged. They kept it up for thousands of years. Then the practice faded, and by around 2,000 years ago, the Chinchorro way of life was gone, absorbed into the farming and herding culture spreading down the Andes. A people who lived on the edge of nothing, ate from the sea, and turned their dead into art. Now go north, into Turkey, because this is where it gets strange. About 11,500 years ago, on a limestone ridge in the southeast, people started building something enormous. It's called Göbeklitepe, and when a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt started digging it up in the mid-90s, it broke the timeline. They quarried T-shaped limestone pillars straight out of the bedrock, some over 5 meters tall, weighing between 10 and 20 tons each, dragged them into position and stood them upright in rings. Then they carved them. Foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, boars, carved in relief with real skill by people who clearly knew those animals intimately, and the people who built it were hunter-gatherers. No pottery, no metal, no wheels, no carts, no draft animals, flint, timber, rope, and each other. So who were they? The hills of southeastern Anatolia back then were nothing like the dry country there today. Open woodland and grassland, thick with game. Gazelle herds moving through on migration, wild boar, red deer, aurochs, wild wheat and barley growing on the slopes on their own. By prehistoric standards, an extraordinarily rich place to be alive. The bones dug out of the site prove it. Overwhelmingly wild animals, gazelle above all. Nobody was farming. They were hunting a landscape generous enough to feed a crowd. They lived in small mobile bands scattered across those hills, following the game through the seasons, sleeping in light shelters rather than permanent houses. Their toolkit was flint, blades, scrapers, arrowheads, struck with real precision. They ground wild grain on stone, and they clearly had specialists among them, because you don't get carving of that quality from someone doing it occasionally. Then, at certain times of year, they came together. That's the best reading of the site, not a village, but a gathering place. Scattered bands converging on the ridge to build, to carve, and to feast. Archaeologists have found the debris of enormous meals there. Which means the reason to organize all that labor wasn't food or shelter or defense. It was belief and each other. And there's a real possibility the causation runs backwards from what we always assumed. Not we farmed so we could build, but we wanted to gather here so we needed to feed the crowd. And that's what pushed us into farming. Some of the earliest domesticated wheat on Earth comes from this exact region. The monument might have come first, and civilization followed it. Now all the way east, to Japan. The people we call the Jomon were living along the Japanese coast, and they'd already been making pottery for thousands of years. The oldest Jomon ceramics go back more than 16,000 years, some of the earliest pottery anywhere on Earth, made by people who never took up farming at all. Think about how backwards that is. Pottery is normally the marker of agricultural life. You need pots to store grain, and you only need storage if you're growing something. The Jomon skipped the farming and kept the pots. They didn't need crops because Japan handed them everything. Warm currents met cold ones offshore and filled the sea with fish. The forests behind them dropped acorns, chestnuts, and walnuts by the ton every autumn and held deer and wild boar. So they fished with bone hooks and harpoons, hunted with bow and arrow, gathered nuts and leached the bitterness out of them and dug up roots. And they stayed. They lived in pit houses, floors dug down into the earth, thatched roofs above, clustered into villages of dozens of dwellings, occupied year after year. They wove baskets, made lacquerware, and decorated their pots by pressing twisted cord into wet clay, which is where the name Jomon comes from, cord-marked. They left the receipts behind in shell middens, rubbish heaps of discarded shells built up over centuries. There's one near Tokyo you can cut a clean section through, and the shell layer runs 4 meters deep. That's not a camp. That's generations of people living in the same spot, throwing dinner out the door until the rubbish became a landform. They carried on like that for over 10,000 years, settled, skilled, and in absolutely no hurry to invent agriculture. So what does all of that add up to? One turned their dead into art on the edge of a dead desert. One carved a monument before they'd built a single village. One made pottery for 10,000 years without ever farming. Every requirement for civilization turns out to be optional somewhere. The difference was never intelligence, just what happened to be lying around and what each of them chose to build from it. So go back to that one sunrise. All three awake at once, none knowing the others were there, everyone certain that their way was simply how humans live. You're descended from one of those experiments, and your life feels every bit as inevitable to you as theirs did to them.